This is the Course of Action podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, Good Pods, and the Reeves Across America radio network. Watch every episode live on YouTube and check out the blog post on jeffclarkofficial.com. All right, everyone, it's not often that I get to read the full book before I have a guest on, but Zach was good enough to send me a book way back when, so I've had enough time to read it before we record, and his book, Rogue Sequence, comes out in June. Zac Topping, how you doing, man?
Oh, I'm great. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, dude. The book is excellent. I'm enjoying it. I'm like 40 pages from the end. I was trying to finish it last night, but I kept dozing off on the couch. You know, those,
Yeah.
9:30, 9 o'clock, starts calling me no matter what I'm doing.
Earlier and earlier each year, too.
Yes, exactly. So, Zach, let's talk a little bit about you. You were in the Army, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep. I was in the United States Army. I joined in 2002. So I was in from 2002 to 2007. Joined right out of high school. I actually joined while I was in high school. And the delayed entry program. I don't know if that's something they still do or not, but
Oh, no,
you can
I
enlist.
did it too.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, that's where, for anyone who doesn't know, who's listening, you enlist while when you enlist, usually you ship out the day of or very shortly after. The delayed entry program allows you to postpone that date. So I was still in high school when I enlisted. 9/11 had happened just a few months prior. And if you weren't joining the military, when other people were going off to college, I knew I needed to do something. So I joined the Army. I was an artillery surveyor on paper. I couldn't tell you what that is because I never actually did it. You go through basic training, went to airborne school, AIT, and got to my duty station. And a month later, we were in Iraq, just occupying space, doing just kind of the general stuff that you do for a year-long deployment. Ended up coming back, and almost immediately after we got back, we got orders to redeploy, but we were reclassing our entire battalion into convoy security element. So on our second deployment, we went back and we were driving armored vehicles, escorting supply convoys throughout the country to different bases and FOBs and camps and stuff. And then by the time we got back from that, it was time to get out. It was already, I was extended for a little bit past my ETS date, got out in 2007. And,
Wow.
Here we are so many years later.
So you kind of really never did your job.
Right. Maybe once or twice on a field training exercise. But at the time, I think my class might have been the last or second to last class to go through AIT and learn surveying, because they were starting to move to more like GPS automated systems where they didn't need us to be driving around plotting grid points and coming up with azimuths for the gun line. We would just, they had computers that could do it on the fly right then and there. So kind of that job became a little obsolete, I believe.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's really, really weird. What was deployment like?
Funny is the wrong word. The two deployments were very different from each other. So 2002 was right at the height of the Iraq invasion. We were already in Afghanistan. It was sort of the Wild West, or that's what it felt like. We got there, and we brought all of our vehicles from Fort Bragg, from our unit in Fort Bragg, to Kuwait City, and drove them from Kuwait all the way up to Mosul, which is one of the northernmost cities in Iraq. But at the time, we still had the green Humvees with the plastic doors and the siding, and they were old, leftover. Like, we were rolling through Iraq with the doors off, like we're in a Jeep Wrangler on the way to the beach, sandbags on the floor. I remember one of our vehicles, one of the Humvees I was in, we had an unsecured 50 cal on a tripod just set on the roof of the Humvee, and the hope was that you would just hold it down if you had to rock and roll with it. It was insane. Luckily, we didn't do anything with that, but it was crazy. We didn't get mail for 6 months. I remember fist fighting people over MREs, because MREs every day, and that was just what you lived on. And then Halliburton KBR kind of picked up, and they brought in chow halls, fancy chow halls, and there was a chow hall on the other side of Mosul, and we would load like as many people as we could into a single Humvee in the middle of the day, no armor, no nothing, and just run the gauntlet through the city to go to this chow hall to get a burger. Um,
Oh,
it was wild. It was a little wild. And then a few years later, we go back, or a year or two later, we go back, and everything had changed. I mean, the plane was landing at Camp Victory. As the plane's landing, we're coming in, you get off on the tarmac, and you can see the trailers, the food trailers, the Burger King trailer, the Pizza Hut trailer, the Subway trailer, the Cinnabon and Starbucks trailers, and I knew it was going to be a completely different deployment altogether. The big corporate machine had gotten in there, and it was very, very different. Vehicles were up armored, and you couldn't leave the wire with less than 3 vehicles. It was much more.
yeah, they learned a lot in those first couple of
Yeah,
years.
yeah, yep. Um, yeah, it was very, very different. Very different. Of course, we were doing a different job then too, but yeah, yeah.
What
So I mean,
was
it's a constant.
what was life like getting out, transitioning?
Getting out was, um, I mean, it was difficult. Everyone who joins and gets out, or a lot of people who join and get out, will understand the difficulties. There's a very different mindset that you have when you are in the military,
Yeah.
and that's by design, right? You join and they break down who you think you are, the person you went in thinking you were, and then they remold you in the image of what they want. Um, and when you live a lifestyle where your job is to be on high alert all the time and always have your head on a swivel, never be complacent, be reactive.
Hmm.
You kind of
High standards.
inspire, and you're right, and a high standard and a constant aggressive posture that serves well enough when you're in a conflict zone. But when you get out and you're around friends and family and the home life, it's hard to turn off,
Yeah.
and it can be very problematic. It can be difficult to do. And it took me some years. Now, I'm not saying I did anything crazy and I didn't, do anything wild, but you still live with this like you have like the personality of a high tension wire, just constantly like taut, and
Yeah.
at any minute something could snap. And I bounced around for a number of years trying to figure out how I fit in this world now, what I was going to do with myself, with my life, where I wanted to be.
Yeah, me too.
I made some poor choices, or in other places where I should have made better choices, I made no choices, and I was just kind of coasting by.
Hmm.
But I had a number of jobs and bounced around. And it wasn't until some years later, maybe with time and age, maturity, or just um, being in the right place, surrounded by the right people who care about you, and people who have good heads on their shoulders and kind of guide you in the right direction. I ended up back home in Connecticut because I lived all over for a while, because that's where I live. I live in Connecticut now, and that's where I grew up. Um, and then, eventually something clicked, and you just kind of got that. You just started to see. I started to see myself from the outside, and was like, this is not. I got to do something better than that.
Yeah.
Um,
It took
yeah.
me a few years of kind of realizing I think I was going through the motions. I was doing what I had to do. I took jobs because I had to, and I was trying to feed the family, and I was just
Mm-hmm.
in the process of that. I told a friend of mine, a former CIA guy, Del Roll. He's in a critique group with me, fellow author. He's going to have amazing books come out one day. And I said, one of the most difficult decisions that you have to make, and it sounds ridiculous, is what you're going to wear for the day. Because every day we wake up, we put camouflage on, and we go into the office. You don't think of it. The only time you think differently of it is if somebody tells you, "Hey, we're wearing a different uniform on a day, or there's a ceremony or whatever." But
Mm-hmm.
other than that, you're in that combat mindset, that perpetual state of readiness. So you're always putting on the same thing. It's never a decision. And then I said,
Mm-hmm.
but when you wake up the next day and you realize, like, well, I don't necessarily have to shave today. Um, I don't have to put on boots and camouflage. Like, you have to start thinking of stuff like that. It sounds minor, but it's actually a really big deal because
Mm-hmm.
you've never put thought into it. Forever, how
Yeah.
long you've been in, you've always just woke up and made sure you had a uniform ready to roll, and you rolled out. And I said, that's a big decision, and it doesn't hit a lot of people because They just don't think it's a big deal. And then when you have to go, oh, I'm going for interviews, I got to put a tie on. I don't ever put a tie on. I got to press my shirt that I never wear. Some people don't even own that stuff.
Hmm.
It's a big deal, and that's why
Yeah.
it's like leaning on your fellow veterans and things like that is really, really important because you just don't estimate how difficult the transition really is and can be. It took me a couple years before I finally kind of figured it out. Like, I really haven't known what I wanted to do. I've
Hmm.
just been checking the box to kind of get by and been comfortable with it. And then once my wife graduated from school and I realized I had the freedom to kind of do what I wanted, I was like, I don't know what I want to do. So I think it's a difficult thing for some people.
Yeah, I agree. And to your point about something that seems as simple as picking out your clothes, once that is on you, you almost feel like you lose that sense of agency, right?
Yeah.
Your identity is I was a soldier, I was a Marine, I was an airman, or you know, you're like you almost feel like you don't have a tribe, and then now this new
Yes.
tribe you're trying to fit in the general society, they weren't where you were. They didn't see what you saw, the
Yeah.
things that they
They
think
don't
are
get it.
critical and important. Like, oh, this guy showed up to an interview with a wrinkly shirt. How? No way. But and then you're like, well, okay, but how's a wrinkly shirt going to affect? Like I did all these other things, and I've been through all these other situations. I don't give a damn about a wrinkly shirt. Something simple like that.
Yeah.
And those things can pile up quick too, especially with that, when you're in that place.
Hmm.
So it's incredibly important to recognize the fact that you're not alone. That so many veterans out there have gone through it and are
Yeah.
going through it at the same time, and don't be ashamed of admitting it or talking to someone, or just recognizing that, taking a minute. You can put your defenses down, and there is a tribe there. You just have to
Yeah. 100%.
be brave enough to admit it and confront it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So when did you know you were going to be an author? When did you say, have that moment where like, you know what, I am going to write a book?
Uh, Man, so I've always loved writing. I always had an active imagination, and I think I've heard you mention this before. I think both of our we share a similar source of inspiration in Michael Crichton. Was
Oh
my
yeah.
discovery of Michael Crichton in Jurassic Park
Yep.
when I was 9 years old when that came out. The movie came out in '93, and I realized it was based on a book, and everyone was telling me, "Oh, you can't. Oh, it's scary. The dinosaurs eat people. You can't do it." And
Yeah.
the more they tried to convince me not to do it, the more I was like, "I'm gonna have to do this, and I'm gonna read it." And at that age, that's a big book. That's not a Goosebumps, R.L. Stein or anything. I was like, "Oh man," but I devoured it, and then I devoured everything Michael Crichton I could, and I just started writing my own stories. Every time I found a blank notebook, I would take it and I would just start penciling in whatever my imagination was running with that day. It was all completely derivative of whatever movie I just watched,
Yeah.
or book I'd read or something like that. There were a lot of stories about scientists getting into these wacky adventures in over their heads, but I just did that for fun. I was just compelled to do that for years. Then, of course, you start to grow up. You go to high school. Everyone's talking about college. What are you going to do? Like we said, then I joined the military, and when you're getting ready for deployments and going to war, I'm not really worried about coming up with stories. But
No.
somehow, through in the quiet spaces, I still managed to write things down with no purpose in mind, no idea. I was like, it wasn't like I'm going to do something with this one day. I would be standing on guard duty, watching the sunrise over a hazy city, and thinking about like how would I describe this in words, just how it went. And then years later, like I met my wife, she was girlfriend at the time. We moved in when we first moved in together. We had this quiet little house at the end of a dead end street with woods all around us, and it was just one of the first senses of calm in a long time that I'd had. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to get back into, and I just started reading all my old favorite books, and I would sit outside in the sun and just kind of relax. And I realized, you know, a little ways into whatever I was reading, I would kind of fade out and just think about how would I write the rest of this chapter if I were to do that, or where would my mind go with this
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
And I just started writing things. And I thought, what if I'm going to write a story, but now that I'm an adult, I can write a full story, a full book, and just print it off at Staples, put it on the shelf, and see what happens. That was the initial thought. And then I started learning about things like Create Space and self-publishing, and I was like, oh, that's cool. We'll do that too. Um, And in doing that, you start to learn that writing is a skill that you can work on, you can
Yeah.
improve, you can, like fitness, or whatever hobby you have or whatever skill you want to work on, you can and should improve it if you're trying to be serious about it. So I started listening to podcasts and reading blogs and going to local author events, talking to people, listening to other authors, and you start to learn about. I learned about how traditional publishing works
Hmm.
and how you have to get an agent, and then your agent has to get an editor, and then an editor may bring it to acquisitions, and the publisher may, whatever, all these steps. And each iteration, each time I learned something new about the process, I was like, well, why don't we just shoot for that? And if it fails, I'll do this. And then I'd make the next step. Well, let's shoot for this and let's shoot for that. So yeah, I just set out. I was like, I want to see if I could write a story that was good enough to get the attention of someone in the industry. And I just so happened to finish writing my debut novel, Wake of War. It's on the shelf behind me back there. It's came out in 2022, but I wrote the draft in 2017 in a local sci-fi fantasy writing convention in Boston called BosCon. It was about to take place, and on the guest list was a particular agent who's now my agent. His name was on the list, and I'd heard his name mentioned a lot in a lot of the interviews and author blogs and stuff that I was reading. And I was like, oh man, this guy is going to be here. Like, I have to go meet him, and I have to show him, figure out. I have no idea how to do this. I'm a natural introvert. Talking to strangers is super difficult.
It's the
Talking in
worst.
general, even to people I know, I
Yeah.
mean, I'd be content just sitting in a room quietly all day. But
Yeah. I can do this all day long, but like put me out in a conference and I'm just like, I'm going to my hotel room.
yeah, oh yeah, no, I
So
know. I
much
go to
easier.
writing conventions. It's great, but it's taxing. It is taxing
It
on the
is.
psyche for sure. Um, but yeah, long story short, I ended up going to the convention. I happened to strike up a conversation with another author whose books I'd read and really liked, and he was just in the lobby. Dan Morin, he writes a spy sci-fi series, and as I was talking to him, this agent walked up, my agent Joshua Billness, and the conversation just happened naturally. We started talking, and from there was, long story short, we ended up signing a few years later and getting a book deal, and here we are. And now, we'll see how long I can keep doing this. So, yeah.
So when did Wake of War came out in 2022?
Yep.
When did you have the idea for your new book, Rogue Sequence? When did that kind of come about and how did it flourish?
Two things, I think. The initial idea for the main character, Ander Rade, is the main character in Rogue Sequence, and he's a larger than life, genetically modified, you know, super soldier, a mercenary. Um, in Rogue Sequence is very much an ode to all of those classic action movies and stories and things I grew up with in the 80s and 90s. And I wanted a larger than life character who was kind of steamrolling through a world he didn't quite understand and trying to figure out his place. And the initial idea came from wrestling with my brothers, actually, years
Hmm.
ago. I have four younger brothers,
Oh, wow.
two of whom are closer in age to me, and my youngest brother is 20 years younger than me. So when we were kids, we grew up with the WWF era,
Oh,
big,
yeah.
everything in the action movies, everything big, showy haymakers and over advertised moves so we could kind of improv, wrestle with each other and play around.
Yep.
And then years later, I was visiting with my younger brother, and he grew up in the post Matrix era, or like, with a lot of the high speed, flashy
Yeah.
anime shows where everything was
Technology.
very, very quick, very wild. And he was just coming at us like a rabid mongoose. And we're like, no, you got to slow down. We can't play. And I was just thinking about how, like, man, I'm just like, we're outdated. And I had this idea of a character, an old, outdated character who's confronting a newer model, if you will. And it just kind of sat in the back of my head for some years. And then after I wrote Wake of War, I knew for my next book, I wanted to lean a little bit more into the sci-fi, because Wake of War is about a fictional Second American Civil War in the year 2037. Um, and I wanted to stretch my legs a little bit and do something a little bit more escapist and fun. And then I brought that idea back and that character, and it came up with the world that we have. And I wanted to blend my love of science fiction, the speculative side of science fiction, the fun, fantastic, gene editing, biomechanical upgrades, bipedal sensory robots, all that fun stuff,
Hmm.
but still stay grounded, because that's where I'm drawn to the grounded side of that, and blend my love of traditional military style thrillers.
Yeah.
Writers like Mark Greaney and Nick Petrie, Greg Hurwitz, that kind of stuff. So I took that military style thriller bones and then wrote a story with the sci-fi coat of paint, and blended the two to see
Yeah, it's
what we
very
could come up with.
grounded. It's a very grounded book. It doesn't, uh, when you say sci-fi, you tend to think way over to the far side of sci-fi and aliens and different
Mm-hmm.
races of species and Star Wars and Star Trek. You think sci-fi way over there. This kind of sci-fi, it's a lot like Andrews and Wilson's new book, 4 Minutes. It's a little sci-fi because it has that speculative science fiction aspect to it, but it's very grounded in military operations. And I think Rogue Sequence is like that too. You get that it's techie. You get that there's, genetic engineering and all that stuff going, highly modifications, but it never goes into such robust detail that you go, okay, we're going off on the nerdy side here. It seems to balance really, really well, and you get the point across that hey, there's a modified individual, there's limitations, there's psyche issues, and you touch on those little things. How did you come up with the idea of the main character? And how did you kind of mix in those psychological issues with the technology modifications to kind of blend that persona together to create like, hey, it's just not some super soldier. He's got difficulties with being a super soldier.
So Andrew Rade, I wanted to write a character, an iconic character, right? Like your Jack Reacher, or your Jack Bauer, or Jack Ryan, or any of the Jacks. But I wanted him to be fallible. I want the characters to be fallible, because that's what makes them believable. That's what keeps them grounded. I mean, a story about someone who can just walk into a room and do anything they want, whenever, without any consequences, is boring
Yeah.
to me. And just, naturally, think about, like we were talking earlier about, in the military, you have an identity, you have a purpose, you have a job, you have an identity. But when you're no longer with that organization, you're still what you are, and you have the skills that you have. But how do you blend into a world that doesn't need that, or a world that doesn't agree with that anymore, a world that looks down on that, or vilifies some of the aspects of what you consider are your personality or your character? And that is Andrew Rade. He's had this moment of clarity where he realizes that maybe his anger that he lived with, in his frustration, right, guided him in the wrong direction. And you can either lean into it and continue to be a villain, or you can try to do something to make better of yourself, or make better, to sort of recompense for your actions. But how
Yeah.
do you do that? Especially when you're designed to be a blunt instrument. And that's sort of, in there's the inherent conflict that he has to deal with in this world, that his kind are, um, they're dangerous. They're unregulated. They're to be feared and contained and rounded up, and kept separate from the rest of society, according to society's desires and designs.
Hmm.
But he's a person, he's a person, and the other people everybody has their own motivations, and that's sort of what grounds them to the world. I think the days of having heroic heroes and villainous villains for the sake of being heroes and villains, sitting, the Dark Lord sitting in the Dark Tower doing dark things because that's just what they are. That's kind of gone. We don't, we need more than that. And not just because we're bored, but that's an important aspect of writing and reading, because we can learn little things about ourselves and about the world. Hopefully, maybe, you
Yeah.
pick up a book and you're reading about a character and you see their motivations, and everyone reads a different book. Everyone comes into stories with their own backgrounds and preconceived notions, or they're going to perceive things in their own way. And that's the beauty of it.
Hmm.
that you could take something as, I mean, someone like Ander Rade, a genetically enhanced, super soldier who's, fist fighting his way through this world, but there's something between the lines, a little bit of humanity in there adds a significant element to the story.
Yeah,
That's what I strive for.
I think something that I've done in recent years is really study character development, and I've went back and watched a lot of movies, and I've said, what are the motivations for this villain? And you can look at something like the Joker in the Dark Knight series, Heath Ledger portrayed, and you can look at him and say, this is just a guy that wants to see the world burn. But he's actually a guy who's against the establishment and the greed, and like when he burns that big pile of money in the movie,
Mm.
he goes through all this effort to steal all this money. You think he's just trying to steal all this money and get rich, and then he burns it, and he says, you know what, it's not about the money, it's about the purpose, it's about the bucking the establishment. And then you go, ooh, that's so, I can relate to that so much. And then you look at somebody like Thanos in the Marvel movies. He's a villain, but his whole purpose was to balance the world. And there's so much resources to go around. But there's so many mouths to feed. So as the world continues to grow, resources continue to be a limiting factor. His whole point was somebody's got to make a hard decision for the betterment of the world, and someone's got to be me, and here's why. It's like you could relate to. I like a villain that I can relate to. I can understand why they're doing what they're doing. I just don't agree with the way they're doing it.
Mhm.
To me, that is a really good villain because the audience can connect with them and they can understand them. And as you said, to your point, the days of the big bad villains, just being big and bad are gone. People want to connect with the villain. They want to connect with the protagonist, and they want to relate to them on a human type of level. And I think that's really important when you're writing in fiction. And I've talked to a lot of authors about this. Like, you can't just write a big bad guy anymore. You have to give them a purpose. The readers have to love them and hate them all at the same time.
Hmm. Yeah, and no one ever thinks they're the villain. I try to keep
Right.
that in mind too when I'm writing these characters. No one, they're doing things because they feel justified in that cause, and everyone else is wrong. And if you can keep that in mind and capture that in the page, then you've created just so much more rich character. Yeah.
So how did you do research for this? Because writing so far into the future can be tricky because um, you have to make it feel advanced, but not so advanced that it's out of touch with potential reality. Now, Rogue sequences in like the 2090s, I believe, right? Um,
Yeah.
so we're talking 60 something years ahead of life. Um, a lot can change between now and then. How did you research and kind of come up with a world that felt 2090s but didn't feel so far out of reality that it maybe wasn't realistic?
When I write, I try to be just descriptive enough to give the reader material to fill in the blanks. And that does a couple things. That one, it lets me cheat a little bit, right? So yeah, this doodad did the thing or whatever, and then I don't have to really worry about how it works. Or I mean, to an extent, you don't want to just do the hand wavium thing. Um, but it also encourages the reader to fill in the blanks. So as they're reading the book, they're imagining how that makes sense.
Yeah, I like
And
that.
then they're engaged with the story more. I kind of compare it to like uh, Chris Nolan, the way he does some of his gadgetry in his movies. Uh, how the hell does that dream machine and Inception work? I don't know. It doesn't really matter to the story, but you
Hmm.
give just enough to go, that looks like, okay, I'm buying that, and then you can
Yeah.
fill in the blanks from there. Um, Also, I think we have this sort of hopeful outlook on the future that, 50 years ago, they would have sworn we'd have flying cars and colonies on Mars already, and
Right.
post-scarcity society and everything would be great. But as you can see, things continue to get more convoluted. They get messier. Um, the population keeps growing, resources keep dwindling, power and money keep consolidating in singular places, and strife is rampant. So, and in this story, the original draft, the book takes place in what we call the United American provinces. So it's no longer the 50 states, or in the book they call it 53 states. It's 5 provinces. So they've consolidated the micro governments that were starting to spawn to try to rein in some of that chaos. So central United States, the flyover states that, if you will, that we call them now, sort of become like this lawless wasteland, and the big anchor cities on the coasts are the new like population centers. And that idea came when I was reading a book. What was it called? Out of the Mountains, I think.
Okay.
It's about the prevalence of guerrilla warfare in the modern combat zone, and they're talking about the concept of littoral zones, right? And that's that area of the shoreline that's accessible from sea, but not so far inland that it's going to start taxing your transportation and delivery systems. So a lot of countries, or you see it a lot in like Mumbai, India, and they're saying in the book they're predicting that like the entire coastline of India by the year 2050 is going to be one giant contiguous city. And so I was thinking about that idea. How, I mean, first of all, it's just great future dystopian sci-fi set dressing, but
Mm-hmm.
there's things to explore in that, and there are elements that we can dive into that the characters can kind of explore, and we can look at ourselves. So in Rogue Sequence, that's the setting. The United States is now the United American Provinces, and they have these centers. That said, that a lot of industries are going to go upside down. A lot of monopolies are going to take over and kind of force out other businesses. So technology might not advance in the way that we want. It'll advance in the way that these powers that have consolidated want, or that even just the system keeping the majority of the population dependent on those systems keeps them subjugated and keeps the people in power. And I wanted to play with that idea with the story, and sort of sometimes in the background, sometimes in the forefront, sometimes pertinent to the plot lines in the story. So and then I just we played with those ideas, and kind of explored them in the pages as I was writing, and that's kind of where we are now.
I think it's very cool because it gives across a very, and I say this complimentary, a very like the districts from the Hunger Games.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like I really liked that. Um, it's very much an advancement on where we're at today, and kind of an expansion, and then kind of a sign that the provinces kind of took control of their governance a little bit, and the way they chose to kind of live their lives. And then, of course, the bigger federal government seems to have changed a lot. How did you visualize all this in your head? Because I'm a very visual person. So if I was writing this book, I'd have a huge map and a whiteboard and all this stuff. And I'd have all this, I'd have my wall covered in sticky notes and all that. Because I'm just a visual person. If I can't visualize it, then I'm going to lose it. So I got to write it down. I got to have whiteboards and sticky notes. How did you put all this together and keep track of it while you're, hammering at the keys?
Yeah, there were whiteboards and drawings and maps and all kinds of stuff. They say you never learn how to write a book; you just learn how to write the book you're writing. So far, and I'm the sequel. I'm writing the sequel, or editing the sequel. The draft is written to Rogue Sequence, and each time I write, it's a different experience. But for this one, I mean, I have maps. I have post-it boards in my office. I have a whiteboard downstairs, notebooks, piles of notebooks full of
Yeah.
notes and drawings, and you go online and print off maps and redraw stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of utter chaos. If I didn't have notes, I would be lost. And even with my notes, sometimes I get lost in my own head, or
Yeah.
where I was. And thank God for copy editors and all the
Yeah.
industry professionals behind the scenes doing the heavy lifting after I hand them a big mess. But
Do
yeah, for
you
sure.
do you outline a lot, or you kind of fly by the seat of your pants a little?
This one, I have loose outlines. So my outlines are usually 50 pages or so, depending on how big the story is. Where a single chapter might be just a paragraph of this is what needs to happen, this is who's in it, move on. Other
Yeah.
times I have a little bit more ideas, deeper ideas, like I actually write down, hand write bits of dialogue or description that I want to get to, something like that. But it's very fluid. It changes a lot. I try to stick with. I have what I call tentpole ideas, or I don't know if I call. That's what I call them. I didn't coin the term, but specific beats in the story that I know I need to get to. Like I know that this is going to be a climactic action scene where some big revelatory thing happens. Now I just got to fill in the blanks and get there and make figure out how the story gets us there um, in a timely manner and drives the plot forward and like you said develops the characters, because if your characters aren't different at the end of the story, then what was the point of following them on that journey other than to just watch
Mm.
things explode or happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean each one it was a little different. I think Rogue Sequence I had most of an outline, but sometimes the story deviates too. You have to be I want to be flexible enough to allow for that deviation. So the end of the story, I think the story will go this way, and then I end up going in a different direction. So if I'm too rigid in an outline, and I've heard other authors talk about like, well, now I feel like I've already written the story, now I'm bored with it. But if I'm not rigid enough, I'll just waste so many hours typing drivel and not knowing where I'm going, walking in circles. So I try to
Yeah.
find somewhere in the middle.
So, what can people expect from Rogue Sequence? And you can do some spoilers or generalized, however you want to.
Um, Rogue Sequence is an action-packed, adrenaline-fueled thrill ride. I hope that
Yeah.
it turns out that way. I wanted it to be a fun, explosive action story with a bit of a power fantasy, with a heavy element of human introspection. It's a story about a larger-than-life character who, like I said, doesn't know how he belongs in the world. Andrew Rade is captured on a mission at the beginning of the story, and his team is taken apart and thrown into these prisons where they're sold around the world in black market prisons and used as prize fighters, like gladiators, like genetically enhanced gladiators. And years later, he's pulled out of prison just to find out that the wider governing body around the world, the World Unity Council, has unanimously labeled modified individuals, or in the book they're called mods, illegal, and they need to be rounded up, controlled, relocated to these confined centers um, because they're dangerous and can't be trusted. And he's pulled out of prison to help the Genetic Compliance Department, which is the agency sort of that was created to round these people up once the ratification of that gene mod ban went through. So he's got to help the agency dedicated to hunting his kind down, hunt down one of his old teammates who's popped back up on the grid and causing trouble. So along the way, he's got to decide, where his allegiance is, where does he stand on this new world that he's been away from for so long, and does he agree with it? Does he do the right thing? Does he find out where he belongs? And you know, hopefully along the way, the reader enjoys a good action thrill ride. The style like the thrillers that I grew up with and the explosive action movies of the 80s and that sort of greater mystery driving the whole story
Yeah.
that leads you from beginning to end, hopefully.
I think there's a very good, you see Raid go through this curve of being from a brawler kind of fighting for survival to questioning tactics and saying, well, instead of walking to a room and punching the first guy in the face, it's kind of like towards, I don't want to spoil anything, but you definitely see the character arc over the course of the book towards the end, where you start to see him thinking a little bit more strategically instead of physically. That punch first, he starts thinking of think first, what's the strategy? And I think he's very, very interesting character. I'd love to hear a little bit about the sequel, if you could say something without spoiling it.
Oh man, yeah. Let me think about this for a sec because I don't even know how much I'm supposed to say. But there is a sequel. Um, oh man, I haven't practiced this part, Jeff. This is barely
There
even
you
thought about this one. Yeah. So adventures continue. The world, it's a wide world with a lot of things. Some things are solved and some things aren't solved. Some things are just uncovered and to find out that there's more at foot. And I wrote it in a way, and I've discussed this with my editor too. I would love to keep writing Andrew Rade books, or at least several more.
Yeah.
And I want each one to be sort of interconnected in a way that they're each book is a standalone, so you can pick it up wherever you want and read. But you're definitely going to get more out of it by reading them in order. But we'll just say, um, yeah, Andrew Rade is back, and there's more to uncover, more to follow. And if when you finish the book or at the end of the rogue sequence, you'll kind of get an idea of where it
Yeah.
might be going.
Are we going to learn more about the mods in the second book?
Yes. Yep. Oh yeah, they're definitely a whole slew of new characters with new abilities and new detriments and all
Yeah.
kinds of mayhem.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
that's kind of the tease in rogue sequences. You keep hearing about it. Oh, they're illegal. It's like, well, what about it is illegal? Like
Mhm.
you just want a little bit more. So that's why I was begging for it. By the time the end of the book was, I was like, man, I really hope he writes the second one because I'd love to hear more about the mods, the whole program behind it. Are there more of them out there? Because you meet Raid, and then of course, was I think it's Turin, the main antagonist. You
Yep.
hear about him. It's like, man, I'd really like to hear more about this program and dig into the weeds. So I'm excited to hear more about that in the second one. You have a title for it yet?
Uh, I have a
Or can you
working
say?
title.
Okay.
Yeah, I have, like I said, I have no idea. I'm probably going to hold off on saying the title because it's
Classified.
yeah, it's classified intel there. NCDI. So yeah, for sure. It definitely we definitely explore more in that world and go a little bit deeper into that. So, and for anyone listening, or these Andrew Rade is he's an early generation modified individual, right? And sort of like the Ian Malcolm quote that your scientists were more concerned with whether or not they could. They didn't stop to think if they should.
Yeah.
As soon as they kind of scientists in this world break the they figure out how to do postnatal gene modification on the fly, and it becomes an arms race between these companies who can create the best gene mod product and sell it for the best price. And it becomes an arms race, this corporate arms race, and they just start producing these things without actually field testing them. And then very shortly, they start to see that you can only mess with the human genome and push it so far before you start to see side effects. And these mods start having side effects, and those side effects cause serious incidents in the general public, which is what scares the World Unity Council into banning it and creating the Genetic Compliance Department to help police these people who are essentially walking, ticking time bombs, if you will. So
Yeah.
rather than treat it, they're rounded up and just kind of tossed aside. And yeah, so yeah, we definitely dig into
Mm,
that in the second
mm.
book.
Cool. So before
Mm.
I let you go, where can people go to find more about you, pre-order the book and all that good stuff?
You can find me on my website, zactopping.com. I'm on Instagram mostly. I used to be on Twitter or X. I still have an account there, but I don't check it so frequently because I'm not a big social media guy, but I do check in. So zactopping.com, Instagram at zactopping. I'm on Facebook. Yeah. And the book will be out June 11th. You can get it in a hardcover, audiobook, ebook,
Ooh.
wherever books are sold.
That's awesome. I do like audiobooks. I like a good audiobook with a good voice, someone who can really tell the story. I'm really getting into audiobooks lately. I think they're a different
Yeah.
kind of art form, so they're really cool.
They are, yeah. Especially when they're done, you get a good narrator to
Hmm.
do that. Yeah, and it's a great way to consume multiple books at once. I have
Yeah.
at any given point, I have an audiobook playing, a hardcover book, an ebook, a book on my phone. It's yeah.
Yeah. Well, Zach, it's been a pleasure, man. I'll let you go for today. I'm looking forward to the big launch of Rogue Sequence. Of course, I've already gotten to read it, but I really encourage everybody to go out there and order it and pick up a copy because it's a very cool, very interesting book. I'm looking forward to a second book. And again, of course, we'll do this again later. You get that second book, so stay in touch and we'll do this again, man.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you, man. I'm really happy to be here.